Welcome in. Once again, this is Tuesdays with Tootle. My name is Stancil Tootle, and we are glad to be back. We kind of been MIA for a couple of weeks. Life showed up, and we had to do a little pivoting. I guess that's the appropriate word. But I think we got most things at least going smoothly, and hopefully you all have missed us as much as we have missed you all. We have with us tonight a true legend, and I've also come to learn that he's a humble cat. So this should be a real good conversation, and hopefully we won't have to pull teeth to get him to share some interesting information with us. We have Mr. Bob Kofter. I think that's, I don't want to butcher his name. And before we really get into the meat of this thing, let's hear a little bit about Bob, and maybe while you're talking right now, let's kind of leave out most of your activism, because we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But just give us a general synopsis of who is Bob.
Well, I could start with a story. Born on a cloudy day in the Bronx, New York, but I won't bore you with that. My background is I grew up in New York City, and my activism, and I'm not going to specifically talk about, ADAPT and some of the stuff with Rev Up. I'll do that later. But my grandmother was really my inspiration. She was a union organizer. She was from Eastern Europe and came over to the United States. And back in the 50s, if you were for civil rights, union rights, civil rights, you were a communist. And literally my grandmother would get visits from the FBI. And this is a true story. My grandmother said when one FBI agent came into her house, "What is a nice boy like you doing in the FBI?" And, my grandmother was no more overthrowing the United States, than any of us here. But back then, like in the 50s, it was, just anything that was progressive. And then she belonged to an organization. It was a women's organization called the Emma Lazarus Women's Club. And those of you that don't know the name Emma Lazarus, on the Statue of Liberty is "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses." That was written by Emma Lazarus. And I used to make some very bad poster board signs, putting it up for the meeting. And that was sort of a background. And then in the late 60s, I was drafted into the military, served in the Army, went to Vietnam, came back without a disability, and was looking for a school outside of, New York. And a friend of mine who was a fanatic basketball fan, and for those of you old enough to remember, in the late 60s, there was a big rivalry between the University of Houston and UCLA. Elvin Hayes and what was then Lou Alcindor, now obviously changed the name. And so he went to Houston, and I went down to Houston because out-of-state tuition at the time was $200 a year. Unbelievable in today's world, but that was for 18 hours. And so that's how I got to Texas. I left after I graduated. I left and spent a few years in Sedona, Arizona, where I got in a car wreck, broke my neck, my fault, drank too much, and went through rehab for a year in the Bronx VA. And then again, after my rehab, I decided I didn't want to stay on the East Coast and went back to Houston and got my master's in special education. And through that period of time with my disability, I got involved with a local organization at the time, the Coalition for Barrier-Free Living. And so that's how I got to Texas. And my first involvement, like I said, in anything with disability was after I broke my neck in 1973.
So in 73, down in Texas, well, even in Arizona at that time, the disability movement was kind of low keyed, wasn't it? If there, because Ed Roberts and those cats, they were out there in Berkeley. So was there any really organized disabled groups when you initially became active?
Yeah, it back then it was before the IL movement actually. I mean, Ed Roberts obviously began earlier, but the organized IL movement had not begun. And in Texas, at least, like I said, I got active with the local. It was a cross disability, working on some of the issues we're all familiar with. The Coalition for Barrier-Free Living. I also got involved with the Paralyzed Veterans of America and in Houston, and Texas Paralyzed Veterans Association. So those were my two beginning involvement. And the local Coalition for Barrier-Free Living became one of the first independent living centers and continues to be the Houston Center for Independent Living. It began in 77 or 78, very much like the Boston Center for Independent Living. And obviously it was the start of the independent living movement. And at that time also, after I had gotten my master's, I actually went to work at the University of Houston, and I was the director of what at the time was called the Handicapped Student Services at the University of Houston. And a lot of my involvement in terms of system change was my, involvement as director of the Handicapped Student Services. And at that time, many universities around the country were starting to have directors that had disabilities. So it also kept my involvement, at the local level. And then the one thing, and many people may never have heard of it, but the first national really active group and actually spurred on what everyone remembers as the 504 protests that Judy Heumann is so well known, was all part of a national protest organized by the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, ACCD. You'll find very little information around that. Judy was involved in it. Lex Frieden, some of the well-known people. And ACCD actually started and planned that protest because it wasn't just out in California. There were protests all over the country at HHS offices. The only one that actually sustained was the one everyone's familiar with, and there's been documentaries about the one out in San Francisco. But there were protests in Washington, in many of the regional offices. None of them sustained as long. So, and the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities spurred state coalitions all over the country. And so there were state coalitions that were formed, basically cross-disability, consumer-run, all around the late 70s and early 80s. Many of those have gone away, and ACCD became defunded because most of the funding had come through trainings for 504 grants. And when Ronald Reagan became president, he cut off all that funding. And so ACCD actually disappeared in the early 80s. And I don't think a lot of young people have ever heard of the American Coalition, but that really was one of the model of the cross-disability movement in this country. And Frank Bowe, a deaf guy, was the executive director and organized a lot of that. And his name is not well known either.
And so I want to go back to the 70s a little bit more. And was there much activities of from the different types of groups that you were a part of back in the 70s when it came around to the Rehab Act, or well, that was prior to your accident, wasn't the signage of the Rehab Act? That was about 72, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1973, and it was Title V of the Rehabilitation Act. And what occurred was, even though Title V of the Rehabilitation Act was there, the rules were not done. And that's what spurred the protest in 1977 that is so well known as the 504 protest that the California won. So the actual 504 regs were, promulgated, but, they just weren't implemented by the HEW directives. So it's a part of the history that is not well known. And, most people know about Ed Robertson. Obviously now people know about Judy Heumann and Crip Camp. But, back then, the foundation of a lot of the independent living movement, the cross-disability movement, was founded by, that American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities that was there. And it was all at the same time that the veteran groups were getting more active, the parent movement, the passage of the Developmental Disabilities Act, the, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it was really very, very heady times for disability and laying the foundation for many of the things that we're pushing for, and, laid the foundation for the advocacy that got, the Americans with Disabilities Act finally passed in 1990. It built on the Section 504, but then expanded it beyond just public entities.
Okay. And so let's come on up to the late 80s, prior to the ADA. I think I read about ADAPT came around about the mid 80s,
Right.
correct?
Yeah,
And
it came out of the Atlantis community, which was started in 1978. It was part of the independent living movement. Wade Blank actually started the Atlantis community, and its whole beginning was it got a whole bunch of young people out of nursing facilities, and Wade helped organize one of the first centers that was providing actual in-home services to people. It's a long story, but the actual foundation, when the name ADAPT, that actually happened also out of Denver, but that happened in 1983 when the American Public Transit Association was having their conference, as luck would have it in those days, in Denver. And that's when ADAPT actually started with a very small number of people. And the very first protest specifically focused on, with the name ADAPT, and at the time it was the American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. Some people say accessible public transportation. And that all occurred, that started in 83. And I got involved and went to a training in a protest in 1984. And that's a kind of a funny, not a funny story. I was a VISTA volunteer in Texas. And I got this application, and it was a picture of a toilet bowl with a bus pointing down into the toilet, and the name of it was Don't Flush, Organize. And it was an application for a community organizing training in Washington. And I applied thinking it was, a conference, a training about community organizing. And I was very much surprised that it was a training. It was about community organizing, but it was, it was where I met Mike Auberger and Babs Johnson, who were the leaders with Wade Blank. And, I found out what the word direct action meant. And in those days, there was specific rules that VISTA volunteers couldn't protest. And, so I was not supposed to protest. Well, like so often I've seen in ADAPT, when people are confronted with, quote unquote, the enemy, I just, felt the anger bubble out, not violent anger, but, to bring about the changes. And I followed Mike through a police line, and I was arrested the first time in 1984. And what I have learned in all the years is that you can talk about empowerment, but until you get somebody to actually confront what is facing them, that is true empowerment.
okay, let's take a break right about now. This is Tuesdays with Tootle, and my guest this afternoon is the living legend, someone who has been in the trenches, Mr. Bob Copter, and we are live here. And while we're taking this break, could I get somebody? I think y'all told me my sister Shannon is here. Would you catch us up on what's going on in the chat area, please, ma'am? If she's here.
She's here. but she's off camera. Are you able to BFF? If not, I'll go and take it. Okay, I'll go and take it. I don't.
Okay.
I'm right here.
Okay.
Hi.
All right. Look at, yeah, she's here. Look at
Hi.
her. Yeah.
All right.
Hello. Hi, Bob.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here and joining us today.
Thank you. I'm excited. It's been a while.
Thank you. Just saying good evening and welcome everybody.
Hello.
You gonna?
Okay.
You gonna?
She went away.
She went away.
Yeah, I'll go on and do it. Shannon,
Okay.
I'll do it this time. We're going to into the chat. Linda Harris says, hi, everyone. I have to jump off at 7, but I wanted to hear Bob Kafka, who I have heard so much about. Welcome back, Tootle. Then Stacy put into the chat, Life's Worth Living. There's a link for that. A 4-part series, Life Worth Living. Then there's another link for that. Then she also has activists for disabilities rights, bring people power to the Texas Capitol. And then there's a link for that. I'm assuming that's an article or something, Bob. And then she also put in the Coalition for Barrier-Free Living, Inc. And there's a link for that. And then she put in, and Stacey's on a roll, she put in 1977 disability rights process that broke records and changed laws. And there's a link so that you can go back, and all of us might want to go back and check that out, get some historical data. And it also should get you fired up. Before ADA, that was section 404. And she has a link there where you can go check that out. And she also put in Dr. Frank Bowe, the father of 404. And there's a link there for that. And then there's a greeting where myself and Dr. Hightower, we were speaking to one another. And then Stacy also she put, this is an amazing disability history overview by someone who was there. Honored to be here. Thank you, Tootle. And she kept on coming. And she put another one into the chat, Wade Blank, ADAPT's founder. And there's a link where you can go check that out. Bob Kafka in Washington, 1984. There's a link where you can go check Bob out. And then she put in, don't flush, organize. And then Brian Mosley says, wow, this is a history lesson. Thank you. And that clears the chat, Tootle. I will say, as you're facing the camera, if you were to make it, there you go. You gotta, there you go. Right there.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Appreciate that, bro. Okay, Bob, and we're gonna have to have you back another time to talk more about the history at a later date, because I want to get your input on some of the current events. And I was talking with some people from the Southern Poverty Law Center yesterday, and it seems to me that we are still, when it comes to voting and things like that, we are facing some of the same issues that my daddy was fighting against 50, 60 years ago. And so is it deja vu for you with some of the rhetoric and some of the activities that is going on as far as how people with disabilities are being treated, or how they are trying to take some of our rights back again, or what's your take on that? sir.
I'm really glad. And first of all, let me just commend Georgia on all the work that you've been doing on voting. I sometimes think, excuse me, that Georgia and Texas are trying to rush to the bottom in terms of which state can be the worst voting laws in the country. I think we're beating you, but that's a commend you that you're moving better than we are. But seriously, there is no more important issue than getting out the disability vote. And let me just give you an analogy. When ADA was going through Congress, we all have our different silos: the blind community, the deaf community, the mental health, cognitive, physical, then all the disease categories. When ADA was going through Congress, it brought us all together, because it wasn't that just a blind person or just a deaf or somebody with a closed brain injury, invisible disabilities, mental health. Discrimination was facing us all, and we came together. I think voting is a similar type of thing. Over the years since the ADA, we've sort of gone into our silos based on scarce resources, because each group needs to get dollars for programs. I'm not knocking it, it's the nature of the beast. But what is really important is that now, with the idea that there is such a thing as the disability vote, it's time that it brings us all together at the state level. I really appreciate the fact that there's all these national bills that are going through Congress. And I think we all need to push our Congress people and the senators to pass, the John Lewis and all the other bills that are there. But I think fundamentally we have to do what we did during the ADA passage, and you're doing it in Georgia. I just want to commend you, is that as they throw up barriers, we need to find a way to go around them. In ADAPT, there's a concept called water around a rock. I see the Georgia law and the Texas law as the rock. And we, as the disability community, the disability voting community, have to find a way around that rock. Yes, they're throwing these barriers. Yes, we need, it's there. But the bottom line is, it is what it is. And so it is so important for us to bring the community together. And that's, Rev Up actually started in Texas because, I have this, ADAPT has this concept called the pitchfork approach to advocacy. And the center of that pitchfork, 5 prongs, is direct action, protest, other individuals taking action. But then there's the legal side, which is obviously lawsuits. Then there's the political side, not just legislation, but also activism, including voting. And then there's obviously media and education. And then the 5th prong is bureaucratic, blah, blah, blah. But it's important. So what I think is the most critical issues today for us is that at the local, state level, as well as the national, because everybody focuses on the national issues. Where we're getting screwed all over the country is at the local level. School boards, city councils, county commissioners, we're seeing it over and over again. And what is the conservative movement? They're actually doing more organizing than we are. We have lost our sense that Saul Alinsky talked about, grassroots organizing. And so I think as a community, we need to continue building and making the case that there is such a thing as the disability vote. Because, and I've spoken to Stacy when we were working together about, Rev Up, that we know there's a disability vote, but I'm not sure the candidates truly believe it. And until we can get people registered and get them out to the polls, we're never going to be able to actually impact and get the type of legislation that is necessary. And it's not flashy. It's not the Bob Kapkers. It's the individuals that you don't hear about at all at the grassroots. And the vast majority of people, and I'm sure it's the same in Georgia as it is in Texas, they're not policy wonks. They don't need 3-page policy wonky. They just want to know, what is in it for me? Self-interest is what drives it. And we've defined the disability vote, not just people with disabilities, but the interpreters, family members. Just think of all the professionals that make money off of our disability. Now, I'm not saying we need support, but those people have the same self-interest to get funding for programs that we do. So that's why the disability vote is larger. And we have in Rev Up this visual called the pebble in the pond. And the person with the disability is the pebble. And then all the ripples around them, family members, friends, advocates, professionals, providers, governmental people, all those people. And it is our job as advocates to bring it together. And like I said, I want to commend Georgia. You've pulled together that very diverse coalition of groups. And it ain't easy, but, and then the last thing that I'll get off my soapbox is, especially in our independent living movement, I don't know about how it is in Georgia, but many of our centers and even our area agencies on aging are fairly docile because they're worried. They're 501c3 nonprofits. We don't, Rev Up is nonpartisan, but we're not to the degree that we work on issues. So if every Republican is against Medicaid expansion and every Democrat is for it, and we as a community think Medicaid expansion is important, then supporting the issue is not partisan. And I think it's really important to get that point across, that we are working in a nonpartisan way around issues that we work on and which will further the community integration of us, like the promise in the ADA.
Okay. And before I open up the floor, I want you, what is your take? Well, first, I read, I think it was yesterday, that the Department of Justice has recently sued Texas over their voting rights bills, just like they did Georgia. But what is your take on the bill, the latest thing that is in the Senate, the bill back? Oh, goodness gracious, I'm having a brain freeze. But
Bill back better.
Yeah, Bill back better. There's some talk going around that they could put some things into that bill that would address some of the SSI issues that impact a whole lot of our peers and prevent us from fully participating. From what you have heard or from what you have read, are there plans to offer disabled people some benefits from that bill if we can get the Senate to pass it?
Yeah, Tootle, the Build Back Better, and without getting into every piece of it, there's $150 billion that will benefit home and community-based services, which will also benefit within that $150 billion. It makes money following the person program permanent. It also gives a way that community attendance, personal assistance, whatever you call it, better wages, because what's happening all over the country is that even though we're finding that we have home and community-based services out there, we can't find any attendant because the wages are so low, and Medicaid is the funding source, and the legislature allocates that. So that's why the Build Back Better. So there's $150 billion in there for that. There's also $150 billion for affordable, accessible, integrated housing for low-income people. There's a myriad of things within there that is extremely positive all across, both for the disability community and the low-income community. And, again, one thing about disability is that we cross-cut age, gender, race, sexual orientation. So again, we can be, in the terminology of today, intersectional, because the disability community is by its nature intersectional in terms of that. And then the third big piece, and there's other things, but the third big piece is it's not the Medicaid expansion per se, but it fills the Medicaid gap that many states, mostly in the South, where they have avoided people to be able to get on Medicaid that aren't as low income. And it sort of fits into the shortage of community attendants, because many community attendants don't have health insurance. And so if the Medicaid package within Build Back Better would pass, many of those people who now are not eligible for Medicaid type benefits would be able to get those health insurance, which would hopefully alleviate some of the recruitment and retention difficulties we're having. So it's like you said, it's stalled in the Senate. You have two senators that are supportive, but it is fundamentally we continue to push to do that. And then the challenge will be, once anything like that passes, is you have, the devil is in the details when it starts coming down to the state level. And but first let's get it passed, then we can worry about our work at the local level.
Okay, we're gonna open up the floor.
Yes. We have a couple of questions in the chat that that'll get this Q&A started.
All right.
On the right foot.
All right. Rather than reading out the chat, would the individual who posted those things, would you like to ask your question, or would you rather for it to be read?
Well,
Okay.
let's just go on and read them.
Okay.
All right. The very first one was from Stacy.
If it's from me, I'll take it.
Go for it, Miss
Love
Stacy.
to talk with Bob, always.
I want to answer Stacey's question. It's probably a 3-part question where I won't be able to answer them.
Fun. So I know you've started so many different things. Rev Up, by the way, thank you.
Yeah.
So Galen and I are co-chairing Rev Up Georgia, as you well know. Did I hear you say you were the catalyst for the University Disability Service offices?
No, I wasn't the catalyst. That was my first job. I was part of what was at the time exciting in terms at the university level, as again, back then it was called Handicap Student Services, but there were, yeah, I know, but in Michigan, just in illustration, you know, how in the disability world, they always want to find a name, how to call us, you know, in terms of what's the best thing. You know, Michigan had this thing where they changed the staid logo of the stick guy, and they made it somebody moving fast, and it was called the handicapist. You know, the handicapper. I mean, you know, and again, this
Did he have white fuzzy hair and a beard?
Wow.
yeah, it was sort of a, but you know, the thing is, and I don't want to go off on it because, you know, I mean, Stacy, you're a woman. You're not a person who is a woman. You know, I will tell you, one of the most frustrating things is that, you know, I once put in a grant, and in it, I put disabled person, disabled person, disabled person. It got sent back to me.
For now,
And,
yeah.
you know, oh, you have to use person with a disability. And, you know, it was sent back by a person who didn't have a disability. So I don't want to go into that, but,
Yeah.
but again, you know, the issue of the universities, and I think might be something even in Georgia to look for new young people, because if you had, you know, for those of you that can see, I'm white hair, white beard, and been around the barn a few times, and we need younger, new, active people. And I think the university and the community colleges may be the place for that.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna get off that subject, or Tootle will kick me out of the meeting because we need to talk voting. I do have another question, but I'll hold that one until others get a chance.
No, you all can ask whatever question that Bob is willing to answer. So
Okay,
I will.
let's move to Brian Mosley. Brian had a
Yeah, mine's just a comment.
yeah, go ahead, bro.
I'm enlightened by Bob, your experience and what you're talking about, and I just like the way you laid some of the things out, especially that, you know, the issue isn't really about being partisan. It's all about what is the issue that we are supporting as a community, because then we can make the vote make a difference. You know, and if we're basing everything on whether it's Republican or Democrat, you know, then we divide our group instead of voting on something that's important or that will impact us as a community. So I like the way you put that. I didn't necessarily have a question.
Yeah, but Brian, you touch on something. You know, for years, I would say the disability community, as perceived in voting, we were a cheap date. You know, they would put on their website a disability platform, and we were, oh, how exciting. They mentioned us. They never put us in the stump speech. They don't stop and do a disability program. And we just need to be more aggressive. You know, the Black, Latino, gay, lesbian community, they're not ashamed to call them on that. But the disability community has been relatively timid because, you know, we don't think we want to be accepted, and we think if we're going to piss them off, that they won't invite us to the party. And, you know, I think other groups that have been, you know, went through the same evolution. If you think about it, what's happened? You know, we were on the streets, we have the ADA. Now it's a logical evolution like other civil rights groups. Now we're moving to the ballot box. That doesn't mean we're not going to stop, you know, doing direct action. It doesn't mean we're not going to stop legislation. But if we don't get our people out and it's for all groups. I think we just got to stop this woe is me and, hoping the John Lewis Act passes. I hope it passes. But the bottom line is it don't look likely. And so we just need to get people out. And if you like the positions of who's running for the Democrat, or if you like the position who's running for the Republican in your state, that's where we're going to show our power. And that's the word that we need to keep putting, the power of the disability vote,
Yes.
to everybody, the power.
Thank you,
and the
Robert.
only way
Thank
it
you.
is turn the people out and get them to participate. Again, right now, they don't believe there's a disability vote unless we actually show up.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bob, this is Galen Tootle. I'm glad to hear you say that because I'd like to think that you were my mentor and I didn't even know it. Because I believe, and I think Stacy and them, they'll tell you, I believe in exactly what you're saying. I think it is time out. I mean, we have to be a little bit more aggressive in what we do, and we got to make our people understand that for whatever reason, you got to get out and vote, because right now it's the law. Now, I do happen to feel that the John Lewis Act, one of those will pass, because I know people like me, we call the Senate switchboard every morning, and we leave messages for Chuck Schumer, Joe Manchin, and all of them. So I do believe that the bill will, there will be something passed, because we got folk on hunger strikes, we got folk getting locked up. So we're not going to give up on that. But at the same time, I just wanted to appreciate, let you know that I appreciate that. And for some of the members here who may think I'm a little aggressive sometimes, I think that we have to be. And I'm in a place where my boss allows me to work. And the blessing for that is that I'm in a lot of spaces. So, but I like the fact that you're speaking to a combination of all things: direct action, advocacy for voting rights, and whatever it takes within the framework of what we do in Rev Up Georgia, which is ultimately, as I like to say, and I know they get sick of it, use your power. But that is what we do. And I just wanted to tell you, I like hearing that. And I'll probably go back on mute, won't say much, but I'm getting off on this conversation because that's what I do. And that's what I like. I like hearing the pioneers telling me that I'm doing it the right way. So thanks for that, Bob.